The title of this was Towards a Visionary Yet Viable Peace Policy for the Middle East. How do we get where we want to go from here? Okay. So what I've done is I've divided this into little segments, okay, sections, and I thought I'd bang the gong each time so we know when we're moving on to a new section. And also because it, this is a spiritual place we're in, it's a church, and my thoughts come from that deep space, if you want. So I'm just going to start each section with a moment's stillness. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is put a map of the Middle East on the floor here, which so we know what we're talking about. And you can bear in mind geography as we go along, because geography is incredibly important to conflict resolution. And we're talking about a part of the world, right? We don't know where we're talking about. Okay, so there's quite a good map of the Middle East. And as I'm talking, you can refer to the map. Now, why is this region important? And why is there so much conflict associated with it? And at the same time, why is it such a haven and sanctuary for spiritual traditions? Christianity emerged from here. On that map, you've got the birthplace of Islam and Judaism, three great monotheistic religions. Zoroastrianism as well, another great religion from Iran, and innumerable movements as well, the ancient Egyptian religion, the prehistoric religion. So what explains all this? And this is the bit I want to truncate very, very briefly to explain its geopolitical significance as a region, and why peacemaking in this part of the world is so important, and why it could be so significant. Okay, this region is. When I was young, I wanted to become an archaeologist, so I'm going to start by a few archaeological observations. Some of the very earliest remains of human beings have been found in this region. Very early on in ancient prehistoric times, several 100,000 years ago, there were Neanderthal groups who've been found in the Shanidar Cave, which is on the borders of Iran and Iraq, in the mountains, I believe. And they showed evidence of religious observances. They buried their dead. They painted the bones with red ochre. And they also had bear skulls arranged in a circle to indicate like a cult of the bear. And so that's one of the very earliest archaeological finds on the planet, showing a religious sense of the numinous, shall we say. Also, there are very, very early remains on Mount Carmel and places of early Homo sapiens. The one theory about the evolution of advanced Homo sapiens is that they emerged in Africa and then came up to Europe and Asia. Now this region, particularly the region called the Holy Land, is a land bridge between Africa, Europe and Asia. That's what makes it so important geographically. It's only a small bit of fertile land along the coast there. But that's where you come if you're coming from Africa to Europe. The other site would be Gibraltar, but there isn't a land bridge. And if you're a very sort of primitive kind of hominid character, you're going to want to come across this land bridge. And even today, that's true not just of humans and early ancestral humans, but also great migrating flocks of birds when they come up from Africa to winter elsewhere in Europe or whatever, or to come up for the summer. they actually settle, they have a holiday break in parts of the Holy Land. And it's a well-known fact. Bird watchers go there from all over the world to see these exotic African birds flying north. And they settle in this delta region. It's one of the most stupendous sites of bird watching. So, I would go so far as to say that this part of the world is probably where our ancestors, and I'm talking about the ancestors of all human beings, first began to explore consciousness and language, where the excitement of adventure and travel and journeying became, something of stupendous wonder. And I think it's very interesting that the Abrahamic traditions, as we call them, come from this region. I would take Abraham as a kind of archetype of our own primeval ancestors and their wanderings. In a sense, we all descend from an Abraham, who was walking barefoot in this part of the world over hundreds of thousands of years. And it's very interesting. Paleontologists have just discovered another hominid pushing our family story back, I think, 200,000, 400,000 years, somewhere in Africa, older than Lucy. So this story has still not been unravelled, but I can assure you that the Holy Land and the Fertile Crescent and the surrounding mountains and so on contains the archaeological remains of our evolution as a species. One very interesting variant on this story is by a man called Stan Gooch, who was a London-based archaeologist, who was interested in the evolution of consciousness, which I'm very interested in. That's why I'm interested in archaeology and hominid evolution. And he speculated, in a series of very interesting books, he was Jewish, that maybe the Jewish tradition actually has remnants of an early moon-worshipping proto-hominid late Neanderthal blend. And this explains the strange, canny psychism of the Jewish people and their interest in the occult and mysticism and all that. And anyway, that was a speculation. Stan Gooch is dead, sadly. He can't defend his thesis. But, there may be something to all this. Because certainly Neanderthals and hominids interbred, they're discovering that. So when the story is fully unravelled, he speculated that the Neanderthals were not so good necessarily verbally, but had telepathic contact with one another, that they were more intuitively in touch. But they were defeated by the cleverer Homo sapiens, but they weren't totally wiped out. They went underground, and their achievements like telepathy and so on lived on in certain groups of hominids. Anyway, that's his theory. Interesting theory. The point I'm making is that there's a lot of mysteries in this region. Okay, so fast forward. I would argue that the earliest ancient religious traditions of this region are all oral. In Judaism, you have what's known as the Kabbalah, which is an unwritten down tradition, which predates the written text of the alphabetic Bible. And I brought along with me a pictorial representation of Kabbalah for those that aren't familiar with it. Basically, it's in the form of a tree diagram, the tree of life. And this, I'll put it here. These are called the 10 Sephiroth, which represent spheres of reality, spheres of energy and consciousness. This is Keter, which is the crown chakra, or the crown Sephiroth. It's a bit like the chakra system of Hindus and Buddhists. And it's a microcosm of the human being. We're a microcosm of this diagram, which is a sort of fundamental explanatory tool for explaining existence. And it was handed down orally, according to tradition, from before the time of Abraham, before the time of Moses. And it's what infused and it's the cosmological model that all the prophetic traditions of Israel were working within. And if we talk about a land bridge between continents, the Kabbalah is a cosmic land bridge between human mundane existence and the heavenly worlds. Okay, and the prayer life of Judaism and Israel is premised on the cosmology that you find in the Kabbalah. And the same with Christianity. Again, it's before it became a written tradition, it was an oral tradition. And one of the most astounding and interesting statements that Christ makes is, before Abraham was, I am. Now, the only way he could possibly be saying that is that he knew about this tradition. He's saying, before these named prophets that we know about, Abraham and all the rest, there was the place where I'm speaking from, which is primordial, ancient spirituality, which goes right back to, the millions of years of our evolutionary history, and which he would have inherited orally, as did all the other great teachers of those days. And the same with the Zoroastrian, Proto-Indo-European traditions that Zoroaster represented from Iran. And in Turkey you've got the Hittite culture, the Zoroastrian. These are Proto-Indo-European cultures. Zoroaster, an inspired prophet who received, just like Muhammad, some revelations from Ahura Mazda, was his name for the Great Spirit. And it's very interesting that Indo-European speaking peoples also have a link to this part of the world. Colin Renfrew, who's a masterly archaeological professor at Cambridge, wrote a book called Archaeology and Language, arguing that Anatolia was very possibly the Indo-European homeland, and that they first invented farming there, spread out, some going off to India, some coming up to, the Celts coming to Britain, etc. In my book, The Kabbalah Runes, which I published a couple of years ago and I gave a workshop here about, I speculate that the Hamito-Semitic languages, which come from that region, and the Indo-European languages go back to a common root in prehistoric times. And I think that is archaeologically and historically probable. And the evidence I've put forward is in the book, where I've looked at esoteric Kabbalah as a prototype of Semitic wisdom traditions, and the runes as the prototype of the Indo-European traditions, and find, lo and behold, they marry up, come from a common source. So this is why this region is so important. It's like a homeland for Indo-European and Semitic traditions. Then what happens? Well, something extraordinary happens, which is urbanization and the Neolithic Revolution. This is where farming is invented, where people get the idea of planting seeds and growing crops. This is where the first wheat is grown. Because up until that time, all our ancestors were living as hunter-gatherers, which is fine, but you don't live very long, and it's quite a tough life. You never have much of a surplus, because there's never enough game. You can't keep it or store it. You're living a semi-nomadic existence. And, life's wonderful. Every night around the campfire, making up stories and myths and legends. People had fantastic lives. We all love going on camp. But it's nice to come home. And there was no home to come to till they invented the Neolithic Revolution. And it's thought that this happened possibly in the Bekaa Valley, in the Zagros Mountains. Archaeologists have discovered emmer wheat, a primitive type of wheat that these people started growing. And then they can make bread. And they can make a surplus that can then carry them through the winter. They can start to build houses. In Gulbekli Tepe, in the southeastern bit of Turkey, they discovered this ancient, like Stonehenge type structure with great big stone, trilithon type things. And that seems to represent the transference between hunter-gatherer to Neolithic settlement, as in Katal Huyuk, which is near there. But it's very interesting. The first settled structures they start to build are temple-type structures. They're living in a context of the sacred world, And so when the first cities get built in this part of the world, Jericho is one of the most ancient. And in the Sumerian region, at the foot of the rivers down there, and all the other great cities of Sumeria, the next thing they invent is writing, which means for the first time we can actually access their minds directly. And we can read their sacred texts and stories. And they invent literature and education and mathematics. You said you trained as a mathematician. Well, they invented the 360 degrees geometry of the circle and the 24-hour day and all kinds of things in Sumeria. And were highly advanced, intellectually. Their myths and legends form what we call the Bible, which is really the storybook from this region, is jam-packed with all the stories of ancient Sumeria, Babylon, the Middle East, Egypt. They all sort of sneak in. This should really be called the Bible, or the library of Middle East spirituality. And one of my ambitions as a scholar is to kind of publish a edition in 2 columns showing the actual original text of the Babylonian or Sumerian or Egyptian roots of which sections, because it's a layered document, Bible. So stories like the Noah's flood are actually ancient Sumerian in origin. Now, with urbanisation comes this tremendous goddess culture. And this whole part of the world was a cradle for goddess traditions. It's interesting you're expressing an interest in that. This is a homeland for the goddess traditions as well. And the temples of all these cities had both gods and goddesses being worshipped. Women were on an equal stature to men. They had their own priestess schools, training schools and centres. We know this from the Hittite cultures, Sumerian, Babylonian, Akkadian, Egyptian. And further across, the Indus Valley is really an extension of this region. From the very, very earliest times, you find goddess statuettes being dug up by archaeologists. And they're common in shape and form through the whole region. So you can have a little goddess statuette you dig up in the Nile Valley. You could take it over to the Indus Valley and sell it. And they'd say, oh, well, that's great. That's a model we haven't seen for a couple of years, We'll stick it in our temple. But it's the same motif. It's the fertile goddess. And if you go to the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge or the Ashmolean or the British Museum or whatever, they've got hundreds of these things. They were very, very common. So really what we're talking about is the common religious faith of all these civilizations at the earliest time was reverence, respect, love for the goddess and the goddess's consort. Now Maria Gimbutas, great archaeologist, dug up in the Balkans region, which was basically a continuation of the same culture. The goddess finds of the Vinca culture in the Danube and throughout the Balkans is showing the same archaeological discoveries of all this region. And so there's a common cultural and religious environment between what Maria Gimbutas called Old European culture and this old Middle Eastern culture. Unfortunately, she's dead, but she wrote some amazing books, including The Language of the Goddess, where she interprets the different symbolic pottery marks that are made. Those are also found universally, some of the patterns. It shows a reverence for fertility, for eros, a reverence for nature. So when you talked about the ecological damage we're currently doing to the earth, yes, these ancients were very extremely aware of the need to respect nature, and this is why a lot of their gods were actually taken from nature. The animal deities were symbolic of early shamanic and prehistoric respect for nature. So, the gods of Egypt and Babylon often took animal form, and that wasn't seen as odd. It wasn't seen that the animal, the god doesn't look like an animal. Henry Frankfurt, who became director of the Warburg Institute in London, wrote a book about trying to understand ancient religion, a very great scholar. He said the ancient Egyptians didn't think that, Hathor was actually a cow. What they thought is that the qualities that Hathor energy represents are best symbolized as a cow. She's not actually a big cow. That's to underestimate their intelligence. But they use that as a symbolic, like an icon, to pray through. As they say with Christian icons, you don't pray at the icon, you pray through the icon to God or the saint. So the iconography of ancient polytheistic pagan religions was using these as archetypal windows onto the primal reality, which cannot be figured. Why aren't we all still living in peace? What went wrong? Because these early goddess civilizations, by and large, were pretty peaceful. Only with increasing urbanization and increasing power and wealth came war and armies, which was a gradual process. For tens of thousands of years, they seem to have been able to live in peace, and the goddess stories and the god stories and the love, it's basically one big love story, was the ancient religion. And it seemed by and large to keep them happy and peaceful. What went wrong? Well, several things all at once. Firstly, technology became too powerful. So from bronze, from copper, which is quite a soft metal, can't do much harm, they invent bronze, which is much tougher. The Bronze Age means that people can do a lot more damage. And that's the epoch of the Trojan Wars. And you get the idea of the male hero, the conqueror, the vigorous Achilles figure who's out there to kill. And when I was in Troy recently, I mused a lot about this as a kind of epochal moment, the Trojan War, when that male hero conquers the city dedicated to the goddess, because basically Troy was under the goddess traditions, and Helen hadn't broken any rules according to that culture. She'd chosen a consort, Paris, fine, that's her right. And she'd been welcomed back. But no, male Mycenaean Greeks not going to have it, will destroy the city. Which gave me the idea maybe we should have a peace conference in Troy to make up for all that. But also then iron is invented, which is even more catastrophic as a weapon. And the horse is developed as a vehicle. And also, and this is the crucial thing in terms of religion, the alphabet was invented. And again, the alphabet's invention is right here in this part of the world, as I'm sure you all know. This came from a museum in Israel. It shows the evolution of the alphabet from the earliest simple forms of Proto-Phoenician. And it was the Phoenician traders who lived on the coast of that precise part of the world, the Holy Land, got the idea of an alphabet based on the more complicated writing schemes of the great urban Neolithic centres of Egypt and Mesopotamia. The alphabet revolutionised that, but it also oversimplified it. If you were training as a priest in the ancient Egyptian temple structure, or priestess, you learned the hieroglyphs. It took years. But you also learned all the context that came with the hieroglyphs. The hieroglyphs are just pictures. The reality of what you learned was the metaphysical meaning behind the pictures. You were inducted and initiated slowly into the entire cosmology of faith that was Egyptian religion. The same with Sumerian or Babylonian or any of these others. Suddenly, with the alphabet, all that complex reality, it was thought, can be reduced to a simple book, a text, a Bible, a scripture. And because you could read it and say the words out loud, you suddenly thought you knew it. Right? So, from the perspective of these ancient goddess-sensitive cultures, what happens next is a catastrophe. Because tribes start roaming about with their little alphabetic scripts, believing that they have all the same knowledge as these much, much older and wiser cultures. Okay. And that's from an intellectual perspective, that's a bit of a catastrophe. This is why Plato said in his dialogues that when Thoth invented writing, it was not altogether cheered by the gods, because writing gives the illusion of knowledge rather than reality, which comes with very, very deep knowledge, reflection, meditation, and experience. So alphabetization. Well, then, what had been a common faith between all these peoples begins to differentiate and split, right? And because they all start using different variants of the one alphabetic script, before long they're all writing in what they think are different scripts and different alphabets, creating different languages. And really that's the deep history background to the problem we've still got in the Middle East. So what you get is, any questions up to there?
Just about the metaphysical meaning behind script.
Yeah.
The mediation of that meaning, if it's not through the arrangement of those scripts, is there some prior mediation of that metaphysical meaning before the script, the picture? Is it through dream, or what is this?
Could be through dream, could be through art. It's through our lived experience, and it's through our oral interactions. It's through our prayer lives. Because our ancestors had language, they just didn't oversimplify it by writing it down. They had pure thought. They had spiritual experience.
I would say the meditative how involved in dance or ritual.
Yes.
The Egyptians with their extreme meditation, whereas they could get onto a different level without doing anything at all. The priestesses. That's something which never got back.
Well, it sort of went underground. I'm going to share about where it went. It went underground.
It's very ancient, it's very modern at that time. As you said, maybe the pre-alphabet, but that time, that energy, and as you said, it wasn't easy for them to study to be a priestess. It was a lot of work. And again, it's interesting to reflect that it sort of links back to the, again, what you think about the Neanderthal consciousness that was beyond language. And this, this is what the ancient, they were living this energy. And how did that, the end of the predominance of the goddess and the male warrior, very complex but very simple. I don't think the extent of the loss of this ancient knowledge is really, can't be understood.
No, sadly not. This story is not. For a long time, it was not permitted to tell this story.
We don't need language. We just need to be in the same energy. I mean, if you're doing a dance performance, it doesn't matter what language you speak. You will get in a voice. You don't need to understand. So it's a universal language of this energy, of the way that your energy as a performer, as a priestess, how that reflects on the person who's the audience, or the interaction.
Yes. Well, I think you're onto something there. Do you have any questions?
We might listen to music in a language that we know nothing about. Nothing about language, but we can still tune in to something that goes beyond the language. Similarly, in a performance, we may not be familiar with the specific language of dance, but we can nevertheless, connect to something that nevertheless goes beyond that.
Well, that's why the arts are so powerful, really, and why the muses, which were the sort of line manager of the arts, are important in Plato's thought and later academic work. That's why I run the Castle of the Muses, you see, very subversive. Okay, do you have a question or shall I carry on for a bit? Okay, so I want to talk about what happened with alphabetization. And there's only one other thinker who's even begun to talk about this importance. There's a guy called Leonard Schlein who wrote a book called The Alphabet versus the Goddess, which tells this story. He's dead, unfortunately. But, its real impact as a tool hasn't really been fully, I think, understood. In the Hellenistic tradition, the alphabet spread and the Greek alphabet developed in the whole Eastern Mediterranean region. That became eventually the ancestor of the Roman alphabet, the Etruscan, and all the subsequent European alphabets. The Hellenistic culture took this invention, and pretty soon we're producing religious literature in the form of Homer and Hesiod. And they kept a lot of the ancient wisdom within their texts. If you read Homer, before my daughter went to Cambridge University, I insisted she read the whole of Homer as like a preliminary to doing a degree, and she did and loved it. The legends, the myths of the ancient Greeks keep a lot of the wisdom of these ancient cultures, and they specifically keep the goddess traditions and teachings. So you get, the great stories of Paris is having to choose between Hera, Aphrodite, and Athena, wisdom, power, and beauty. Of course, he should have said, I'm not going to choose, you're all beautiful, That's the correct answer. So anyway, the Hellenistic tradition kept these ancient wisdom ideals, and peace, Irene, was in the mythology a goddess associated with Aphrodite. Irene is an attendant on love, which is interesting. I think the Greeks got it about right. You can't have true love, you can't have space and time for eros unless you're in a peaceful culture and civilization, and a civilization that values love and eros. Ancient India developed eros to a high art because it valued peace. You couldn't become a Brahmin or a sage unless you'd sworn to peace. It was the same in the Druid culture in the Celtic lands. Anyway, it's also interesting, the Hellenistic culture probably gave the name to Palestine because the Philistines, who were settling on the coastal region of the Holy Land, seem to have been Greek or speaking some kind of Mycenaean language. Their pottery that they found was all Mycenaean type pottery. There's a legend that Perseus rescued Andromeda off a rock off Jaffa Harbour, and then he went on to found Tiryns and ultimately Mycenaean Argos. So Perseus, kind of from that ancient heroic age of Greek mythology, rescuing the goddess Andromeda, who's been stranded on a rock and tied to a rock, is perhaps an archetypal story about the rescuing of the abandoned goddess. If you think about Europa, she also was a Phoenician princess who is captured by Zeus. And her brothers then go out looking for her. And Cadmus is the key one, who then founds Thebes. And according to Greek mythography, he brought the alphabet to Greece for the first time. So the Hellenistic tradition is very rich, and later it gives birth to philosophy as such. Now, when I went recently on a pilgrimage to Miletus and Ephesus, two very ancient cities on the Anatolian coast, I discovered something very interesting, that Miletus, which is where Thales came from, the first philosopher, was actually a Minoan settlement from Crete. And Crete was the homeland of Zeus and also Hera. So Minoan culture, and which was earlier even than Mycenaean culture, is really at the root of these Greek legends and ancient stories. And philosophy comes along to try and not to supersede or replace the myths, but to try and explain them, and to explain them in a psychological and a philosophical way, to get to the meaning of these things. And this really, in the Platonic tradition, was the function of higher thought. How can we take our myths and legends and then see what they mean to us, philosophically and psychologically? And then you get the whole tradition of Aristotle and the beginning of academic thought. Now, interestingly, Aristotle was descended from a bunch of doctors. His father was a doctor, and so on and so on. Going back by descent to Asclepius. The Greek medical profession believed that great doctors were descended from Asclepius, who was the son of Apollo. And Aristotle was very proud of this fact, which is why he founded the Lyceum in a temple to Apollo in Athens. Well, it was a gymnasium attached to the centre for Apollo. And so he worked with the energy of Apollo, who's the light bringer. And I'm particularly interested in sort of the esoteric roots of Greek philosophy, both Aristotelian and Platonic. I think they trace back to the very early ancient mysteries of the Greeks, which were the remainders of the ancient mystery traditions of the goddess cultures universally. Now, Pythagoras, who's a very important figure in this story, he was half Phoenician. His father was Phoenician, his mother was Greek from Samos. And so he combined within himself the Semitic and the Indo-European lineages. And he was looking for the universal wisdom that transcends any particular text or revelatory school, which took him to Phoenicia. He went to all the temples, Egypt, Babylon, some say India, it's possible, all over Greece, Delphi and so on. And eventually settling in Crotona in southern Italy. So wherever he went, he was trying to get to this metaphysical core at the root of all the common wisdom traditions. And the goddess tradition was absolutely central. Now, he coined the word philosophy, meaning the love of Sophia, who is, if you want, the quintessence of that feminine deity. If you take all the goddess traditions of all the planet and put them together, you'd probably want to call it Sophia, because that's the tradition. That's certainly what Pythagoras was arguing. It's that wisdom energy that we should love. And that's what it means to be a philosopher. Okay, so what was going on in the Persian world was slightly different. Zoroaster came along with a slightly, I would say, and no insult to my Persian friends, a slightly less sophisticated intellectual grasp of things than Pythagoras and Plato and Aristotle had. For Zoroaster, things are very black and white. There were the good guys, Ahura Mazda, and there were the bad guys, Angra Mainyu, the devil. This is the invention of the devil notion, right? The Greeks didn't have time for a devil. Yes, there's suffering, there's sorrow, there's grief, there's death, but because there's reincarnation and justice, there's no, everybody wins in the end. There isn't a devil. There's mistakes, and the only devil in Plato is ignorance. That's what we're all up against. And there's a remedy for that. It's called education and philosophy. So there's no devil figure. Whereas Zoroaster, I don't think had reached quite as high initiatory level of wisdom as Pythagoras and the Greek thinkers. And he insisted on this very black and white, cut and dried system, whereby, as I say, there's the good God and there's the bad God. And in his worldview, mankind is created to assist the good God to defeat the bad God. What we see in everyday downtown Edinburgh is literally the battlefield of the last battle between good and evil. And, it's quite heavy as a cosmology, because God and the devil are fighting it out, and we have to take sides. Some of us choose evil, some of us choose good. And unfortunately, this became associated with the Persian Empire. Otherwise we'd never have heard of Zoroaster. He'd just been a quaint little priest who'd had some bad visions living in what was then Afghanistan. But because his ideas became the dominant religious belief of the Persian Empire, they spread throughout the greatest empire the world had ever seen. They conquered the entire Middle East. Right? And they had a huge impact on later religious ideas. Now, the Persians tried to conquer Greece, as you know. It's one of the great epic stories of history, and failed. But they left their ideas in very strong imprint in both Judaism, Christianity and Islam. So what we're doing in trying to make peace in the Middle East is in a sense still trying to do a clean-up act from that early dualistic imperialism. This whole notion that I will conquer you, your people are evil, because I'm working with the good God and you're working with the bad God, that whole idea is a Persian invention. And I think what we have to do is we have to psychologize the origins of it and somehow take people that still believe in that literally to a different plane of awareness, a higher plane of reason. Now, and I'll come back to that a bit later. In Judaism, okay, so what was the story with Judaism? By the way, the Zoroastrians got their text, they got their alphabet, and they wrote these things down in an ancient script, Avestan. And Zoroaster probably lived sometime about 1700 BC, very early, around the time of Abraham. But it wasn't written down till later. The Jews come into the story in a very important way because they're right at the epicenter of the scripts being invented. And they begin to write down their particular narratives and stories very early on. And with the story of Abraham and even earlier with the Adam and Eve stories, which are mostly taken from these early goddess cultures. But unfortunately they're subverted. If you read a very important book called The Paradise Papers by Merlin Stone, she explains how the biblical narrative of Genesis is a kind of distortion of actual history because it's making the woman look in the wrong. Eve is painted as an assistant with the devil who's tricked mankind into all the things that are going wrong with life. Like we have to work, we're self-conscious, etc. Our fall from grace is because of womankind. Now, I just gave a talk actually in Oxford and London and went to this in some detail. And what I would say is that what Merlin Stone argues is that in the Paradise Papers, she said if we reread Genesis, if we revisit the biblical narrative as an archaeological historical document, look from archaeology at what was actually going on, these early goddess cultures and so on, for thousands and thousands of years, we can see that what's happening is patriarchal alphabetic using males are basically hijacking all that wisdom, subverting the power of the female and their wisdom and calling it all devil worship. And it becomes a text for the persecution of wise women ever since. Where I am in Edinburgh, witches were burned at the stake and drowned and so on. And this was going on all over Europe in the name of that story of Adam and Eve. Now, what Merlin Stone said, she's dead, but I agree with her and has carried on with her work to some extent, is if you freeze the frames, like there's a Bruder film of the Kennedy assassination, you look at it very, very carefully, you can trace where the missing bullets are going. And you can actually say that, no, actually the story here is Eve, who is our ancestor, represents that wisdom, that Sophia element. Okay, she is taking the apple of knowledge, which is the burden of gnosis, for all of us. She's like the Promethean energy that takes wisdom. And, of course, lesser gods are going to be angry. The male ego is going to be very angry. But the actual God of the philosophers is actually prompting her to do this because she's actually making us Homo sapiens. So we should reinvest some research energy into unpicking that text and seeing what it's actually saying, and whether it can be a clue for peace. Because one of the things we're going to be seeing as we look at this in more detail in the Middle East is the disempowerment of women in the region. Women on the whole would quite like to make peace with one another. I've been in meetings of Palestinian women, Israeli women, Iraqi, Syrian. They're quite happy to be at peace with each other. They've got the same kind of concerns, their children, their love affairs, their marriages, have they got enough money for the rent, common human interests. And killing and war and blowing up each other's homes isn't part of the story. So the disempowerment of women, this is why the search for women's empowerment, we just had International Women's Day recently, and the search for peace are very, very, very closely related. I'm pleased to say that the London School of Economics, where I did part of my degree, has just set up a centre for the study of women and peace and security, founded by the collaboration of Angelina Jolie Pitt and William Hague, former Foreign Minister. And, that's going to become a new academic centre in Britain, studying women's relationship to lack of peace and peace. So I would say that the empowerment of women in the Middle East and the advent of peace are closely connected things. And therefore we have to retrace and rethink this narrative of woman being responsible for sin and evil and suffering, because too many people still take that story literally. But in Judaism, notwithstanding all that, the goddess keeps getting into the Bible. She still keeps coming in as wisdom. Okay, so if you really, deeply study biblical research and literature, you will find for instance, the Ketuvim, the wisdom writings, that the goddess of wisdom is the consort of God and dances with her at creation. Okay, that's very interesting, and that I would say is a sort of a folk memory, an archetypal memory in the minds of the scribes writing this stuff of those thousands of years of Middle Eastern goddess spirituality, but that is biblically orthodox, and it comes particularly through the mind of Solomon, and the fact that many of these wisdom writings are ascribed to Solomon, whether or not it's true that Solomon himself had something to do with them, or was an oral transmission, or what. Scholarship loves all those mystery puzzles. But I would say that archetypally it's true. And Solomon, the king of peace, after all, the builder of the first temple in Jerusalem, I think should be allowed to have a word about how we can get peace in the Middle East. And his thing is revere the goddess of wisdom. It's as simple as that. And every Orthodox Jew on the planet really should be doing that. And many of them are. I'll come back to that a bit later. Another part of the story, the Greek alphabet then, as I say, is taken to Magna Graecae, to the colonies of Sicily and Greece proper, Crotona, where Pythagoras was. And then the Etruscan peoples get the alphabet, and the Romans. The Romans come into the story because obviously they develop a large empire, and today is the Ides of March, 15th of March, and Caesar's assassination took place on this day, I think in 44 BC. He dreamt of an empire that would be as great as Alexander the Great's. He was a great megalomaniac, military conqueror. And in a sense, that's the problem with Rome. And the problem was that in their conquest of Jerusalem and Israel, there broke out this huge battle between Rome and the traditions it stood for, and Judaism. And it's written about by Josephus in the story of the Jewish revolt against Rome. Most horrendous bloodshed on both sides. The Romans were crucifying people like you wouldn't believe. They crucified hundreds when they could capture them. The Jesus crucifixion was just one tiny little side story. They were going for genocide, effectively, of the Jewish people. And they were doing it in the name of their gods, because for them, the Jews were blaspheming by saying there was only one God, and that was an invisible God. And he favoured especially their little tribe. For the Roman generals, this was blasphemy. Whereas for the Jews, the Romans were blasphemous, because they worshipped statues and all kinds of tangible things, whereas the Jews worshipped an invisible spirit. So there was this cultural clash, right? And that still informs a lot of the battleground that's currently in the Middle East. I think what we have to do is philosophically untangle it and try and resolve it. Now, I'm going to say, where does Christianity come in? Because it has its alphabet and its scripture. I'm going to argue that Christianity was part of an attempted peace movement trying to mediate this clash between Judaism and Roman Hellenistic culture. Christ, I think, as a teacher in Galilee and Jerusalem, had students who were Jewish, he had students who were Romanized Hellenics. He was trying to say, look, there's a place we can go to, which is a place of love, which transcends this battle. You don't have to be a hardline Orthodox Jew killing Romans. You don't have to be a hardline Orthodox Roman killing Jews. You can join my party, called the Kingdom of God, where you renounce all that, you put wisdom first, and you put genuine love, affection, agape first, and you stop doing violence. You know, it was a simple, brilliant and beautiful idea, and Christ was, I think, a very learned rabbi who'd studied deeply of the wisdom traditions of Christianity, of Judaism. His name, Jesus, was actually the name of Jesus ben Sirach, who wrote one of the books on the wisdom tradition. And I believe that Jesus was possibly named after, I think he was coming from the tradition of that wisdom school within Judaism. And that his parents, when they took him to Egypt, probably had links to Egypt. And Egypt was the place of Philo and that wisdom tradition within Judaism. So there's lots of kind of mysteries to study there. It's very interesting. Right, then we come to Islam. So what I'm arguing here about Christianity is it was a conscious attempt to say to these battling, worldviews, look, let's just make peace, let's get back to the ancient wisdom tradition that used to be here in this land. And it's interesting that Christ institutes the bread mysteries. He's born in Bethlehem. Now, do you remember what I said about this is the origin of wheat, this part of the world? This is where we invented bread, right, and wheat, and wine, which was discovered around this part of the world. And Christ institutes what? His big thing is a bread and wine mystery. It's like he's saying, I come from that very early ancient wisdom tradition, goddess-based, ancient primordial wisdom. And our tradition is one of love, which predates all this stuff. And so, please make peace. And that, if you read the scriptures, if you do your theology and you study New Testament stuff in depth, I think that's what you will find is the case. And more that's studied of Gnostic writings and the Gospel of Thomas and all this stuff. Seems to me that what I've just said is again, orthodox, actually. It's very interesting when I was in the Vatican Library a couple of years ago, reading away, and they've got some access to some very advanced scholarship that's going on, discovering the Gnostic and spiritual and esoteric roots of the New Testament, which I think fits in with what I'm saying about its origin in wisdom teachings. And I think the idea of Christ as the Son of God is actually a glyph for the wisdom that flowed through him as a person and as he was teaching. One way of trying to describe that is that the goddess of wisdom is in him. And if you look at the script very carefully, that seems to be what they were saying. Okay, fast forward. The trouble is, of course, when these great spiritual ideas get picked up by military empires, they get distorted. And so there's a very long way from Christ having private discussions with his close disciples and sharing the mysteries to the church after Constantine persecuting Gnostics as heretics and, inventing orthodoxy, right? So what happens in history is that you get these brilliant ideas that are then, and it's a sociological phenomena, they gradually become watered out and distorted, and like Chinese whispers, a few generations down, they're doing stuff that the founders would never have recognised as what they were talking about. So Christianity by that time had become a kind of big business based in Constantinople. It was really big on church building, on saint production. Saints had to be celibate and life-denying. they got into anti-Semitism in quite a big way because Christ had been, killed by the awful Jews. So to prove that you're a really good Christian, you had to really not like Jews. The Constantinople Empire eventually made the Jews wear little crosses and Stars of David, just like the Nazis did, to distinguish them. And they went around feeling, they were smug and they were the chosen people. They did some great art and hymn singing, and I love aspects of Byzantine culture, and I went carefully around Istanbul just last year, meditating on all this. But I tell you, the Byzantine Empire was full of plots and counterplots, and they were all, very few Byzantine emperors ever lived to a ripe old age. They were all killed by their wives or sons, or they were all poisoned or hacked to death. It's the most brutal story. And if this is what Christianity is, well then God help us. And in a sense, what I'm going to argue is that Islam arose as a grassroots movement on the fringes of all this in the desert, as a reaction against it, as a Gnostic movement. He was an unlettered person in the desert who had picked up oral stories from his wife Khadija and her cousin Waraka, who'd picked up stories that were going around the desert about Mary and Jesus. And he wasn't a sophisticated theologian. He never studied formally, but he had common sense. And as Carlyle said in his essay on Muhammad, he had the kind of naive genius of someone coming at spirit afresh. And he puts together in the Quran this extraordinary revelatory sequence, which I've actually spent a few years doing a commentary on. So, if anyone's interested, you can sit and listen to my commentary on the Quran, where I go into each surah and each verse in detail, trying to sort of get back into the mind of Muhammad. Why did that come out then, from a more metaphysical perspective, like a philosophical commentary on it? So that's the first bit of what I wanted to say. I'm going to pause there, and that sets the scene for where we are in the modern world. And really, if we're going to try and sort out the mess we're in at the moment, we have to know that grounding. Okay. So
I feel that this kind of big story is probably going to be for a very small proportion of people. I'm just thinking of
Sure.
But for the vast body of humanity, additional strategies will be needed.
Well, okay. So I'm not completely sure I agree with you actually on this, because I think that the internet has now revolutionised this story access, because I think that someone in a little village in Africa or in Alaska or anywhere on the planet with access to the internet can now access this story. What I'm talking about is actually now in the public domain. For the first time in the planet's history, in ancient times, esoteric knowledge was kept for a small group of people, and it was handed down by orally and word of mouth, and it was for initiates and all kinds of things. I think that has now changed. For the first time in the history of humanity, you can access the wisdom story of mankind, which I think is a very exciting time to be living. So that's my first comment. The second point is that I think actually this is everybody's story. So I don't think it belongs to a Gnostic elite anymore. I think it belongs to everybody. And I've been a teacher in the front line of schools for 10 years in Britain, and when I share little bits of this story, little kids from working class backgrounds who've got 3 books in their house, they get it. They recognise this story because we all come from that Sophia. And so I think that I disagree with you. I think this is a universal story. And it also, maybe it comes from my liberational thrust from my Marxist origins. When Marx was talking about we need to get to our species' essence, he was talking about, liberation for mankind from social oppression, economic oppression, but also mental oppression. What he was saying is that the religions act as screens that prevent us from accessing our species' essence, which is what we really are. And in some of my work, I've done a lot of work on the Gnostic inspiration that Marx drew on, which has been airbrushed out of history. Because just as Constantine didn't embody Christ properly. Stalin certainly didn't embody Marx properly. So I think that this is a universal story, and we are Homo sapiens. And I think that if it's presented in the right way, most people can get this story. But I agree that it can also be presented. I could have danced this story. It's just I'm not a very good dancer. I apologise. I'm a philosopher and historian, so that's my way of presenting. But it can be put in many media, and it's exciting. Many people are doing that. Places like the Schumacher College, and where our friend Scylla Elworthy is giving a talk about the goddess traditions very shortly, with Anne Baring. People are sharing the story, which I think is very exciting. Any other questions?
Well, I would say what you said about the good and evil is the fundamental thing, and I think we have to go back to this world. It's the only way to understand.
To solve it, yeah.
I mean, I've been doing that, and that's why I've been doing that. I've only recognised now why I've been looking at that world for so long. How do we betray the inner goddess with black and white? And it's the black and white that's caused so much disruption.
Right.
The betrayal of Eve. I mean, the authors or Zoroastrians, I think there was some influence on the Manichaees as well.
Oh yeah, they're in the story. I had to truncate. This was all abridged.
St. Augustine, who the church is named after him. I mean, he was initially a philosopher, dabbled in Manichaeanism, but said it wasn't for him.
No, one has to go through that phase.
So he's obviously, to me, things have been misinterpreted. The whole thing is that it's not the black or white; it's the infinite shades of grey.
Yeah.
And that's what don't undermine humanity. They can understand different shades of grey. If you see a dance, a poem, a piece of music with those shades of grey in it that they're into, like you said, 3 books that they've got it. You don't need the vastness of that type of knowledge necessarily to understand. Maybe for some people it will help, but and the peacemaker, Sami Awad. I discussed this with him about the shades of grey, and he said it, and the women. And he said that's exactly the way to go. That's exactly the way we should be looking at things.
I mean, just coming back on that, I mean, I agree that people can recognise some of these archetypal stories, even young children. But there is a context of that understanding. I mean, they're so heavily conditioned by a lot of the things people are conditioned with in a contemporary existence. And they're also carrying a lot of that conditioning. And that is the challenge is that you can get these chinks of light coming through of recognition from these ancient stories. But the context through which that comes down is such a conditioned state of humanity that that's partly where I feel the challenge is.
Sure. No, I'm not underestimating the challenge. I mean, there are 2 schools of Buddhism. There's the Sudden Enlightenment school, and there's the Gradual Enlightenment school. Okay, the 2 schools of Zen, if you want. And I'm in the Sudden Enlightenment school. I'm an optimist. I do think it is possible. I think if the problem is the control of the media and access to the story. You have to be incredible. I mean, it's taken me 35 years of intense study in libraries all over the world, going to lectures, listening to some very, very wise people to piece this narrative together. And that's just sheer dogged determination. And most people don't have the patience. They wouldn't do it. So, I'm making it sound easy, but it's taken an enormous amount of effort. And I've noticed often with kids these days, when I teach them, they actually don't have intellectual discipline to make efforts anymore. If I ask a bunch of kids to go off and read a gospel, they'll say, "Well, a whole gospel? What?" And that's your homework. Just this term, just read Luke. You've got to be kidding. Give us a couple of paragraphs. Whereas, in my generation, we would lap up the intellectual challenge of reading, texts and stuff. So there is a problem. The internet, the media that's creating the possibility of accessing wisdom is also dumbing people down into little sound bites on Facebook. So we have a problem. And I'm not underestimating it. But can I move on a little bit? I want to just move on to the next bit of the story. Where's my gong? This is very important. Okay, so I just want to look a bit at what happened next in the medieval period, which is a huge, long period from, early Christian consolidation, 5th century AD, 6th century AD, up to the modern period. It was a period of the consolidation of empires, and in the Middle East, firstly the Byzantine Empire, during which wisdom had to hide underground. I've just been to Cappadocia, where literally they build churches and chapels and hide underground. And this notion of Christ as the incarnation of Sophia was mouthed in Byzantium, and Hagia Sophia is built as the great mother church there. And, mystically the sacraments are understood as an image of wisdom absorption. But unfortunately, because of this problem, now Christians explain what you're talking about, the slowness to understand, as a consequence of what they would call original sin. There's a kind of implicit ignorance inside us, which is very hard to grow out of. I've coined a phrase, Sophia-phobia, and I've written a book about it, which is the fear of wisdom. If Christ is the incarnation of wisdom, well, no wonder we're all terrified. No wonder the rabbis were terrified and the Roman rulers who crucified him. Because secretly we want wisdom, but deep down we're afraid of it, because it brings responsibility and too much knowledge. Also, there's the thing that Christ was a kind of magician. Morton Smith has written about that. We could say Christ was a white magician who was bringing too much wisdom too rapidly to people. And like you say, the vessels then break. They can't cope with it. So what you do, you have to kill it. You have to snuff it out. But of course it didn't happen. It lived on. And the church then tries to contain it. In its sacraments, in its liturgy, and its rituals. It becomes a kind of a ballet built around the incarnation of wisdom and its containment. A bit like a kind of nuclear reactor. You can't have it going off too much. You stick it in a box and then run electricity charges off it. But I think there is, if my thesis is correct, that what Christ was really trying to do was bring back the goddess mysteries of peace, then I still think that is a revolutionary potential within all the churches. And I would, if there was time, I could explain how in all the denominations of Christianity there have been thinkers in each age who've basically said that. There is a universalizing wisdom tradition within Christianity, which is at the very heart of the Church's teachings. Now it's interesting, in the Catholic tradition, that's what is meant by universality. The word Catholic means universal, and it means someone who can access that universal wisdom teaching. I've just got back from India, in Madras. I went to the tomb of St. Thomas, who's my patron saint and namesake. And again, I think that Thomas tradition represents that repressed or suppressed, authentic Gnosticism. Clement of Alexandria used the term Orthodox Gnosticism. That's actually at the root of authentic Christianity. But unfortunately, it constantly is getting subverted by the social politics of the church and the poverty of our institutional ability to deal with revelation. It's the same in Israel, and the whole history of Christianity in the Middle Ages is summed up by the clash of those forces. The same in Israel. You have the wisdom traditions known by the great rabbis and the great masters of the Torah. They developed this incredible oral commentary on the Torah. So, the commentary is what brings all that depth and wisdom to it. The Mishnah and then the Talmud get written down at the start of the medieval period. And it's always understood that the scripture needs the commentary. You can't have... Judaism isn't just the scripture, it's the interpretation and commentary which only the rabbi has the key to, by which you can read the learned person. That could be any of us, if you've got the discipline to study and learn it, that's you. Okay, so then even later the Kabbalah gets written down, which is this most mystical level of interpretation. And this wonderful man, Lewis Jacobs was an expert on the history of the Jewish religion. This is a superb book about the history of Judaism. And what I'm arguing is that within Judaism, at its very heart, and within Christianity, is found this Gnostic or Sophia tradition. And that is known and accepted and understood by the most profound scholars of, in this case, Israel. Maimonides is a representative in the medieval time of this kind of a mind. He was from Cordova, which is the city I was in last year, and he'd studied Aristotle in great detail. He'd studied the Bible, and he realised you can reconcile them. Now, the only way you can reconcile them is by... he didn't know it because he didn't know about archaeology. A lot of the stuff I've been over so far, wasn't known to these people. But intuitively he knew that the wisdom that shines in Aristotle's text is reconcilable with the biblical wisdom. And that's because Aristotle was coming from this highly profound, initiated, Hellenistic wisdom tradition, which goes back to Apollo and the Muses, and Pythagoras and beyond, which came from this same part of the world as the initiatory tradition that came through Moses and Abraham and the Kabbalah and the Semitic traditions. They can be reconciled because they go back to a common source. What I think is exciting about our epoch is that if only we could get peace in the Middle East, and that's why I'm desperately hoping we can then, as it were, prove it scientifically, archaeologically and factually. Anyway, Maimonides, the nice thing about Aristotle's thing is that God is active intellect. The divine part of each one of us is a creative intellect. It's not a passive mind. Each one of us is put here on this planet to help co-create the world. This is Matthew Fox's creation spirituality, right? That's what Aristotle is saying. And also in his theory of the 10 categories, everything can be resolved into 10 types of things in his metaphysics. It's very similar to the 10 Sephiroth. If I ever have time to retire after we've got peace in the Middle East, I'm going to spend ages working on reconciling the 10 Sephiroth with the 10 categories of Aristotle, because, it can be done. They come from the same root. And also the 10 tetractys of Pythagoras, which is the triangle, the equilateral triangle with 10 dots. So it will go back to the same root. If you haven't studied the Zohar and esoteric, Kabbalah, do. It's very interesting. And also, one of the most incredible Kabbalists who ever lived, Isaac Luria from Spain, went to Safat and founded a little school there, which is still going in Safat in Israel. And these people, they're praying for... They realise that peace will only ever come to the Middle East when it also comes metaphysically and in a reconciliation in the heaven worlds between people that hold these different rival versions of reality. Luria said what we need is tikkun, which is healing or redemption. And that will only happen through prayer, is what he said. And that's very interesting, because then we have to ask, well, what kinds of prayer? Okay, now the same thing is also happening in Islam. Because after the impulses of Muhammad, which was a difficult and crazy life, in my commentary on the Quran, Muhammad got a lot of opposition. He had to fight battles. He's unique among the great prophets of history in that he also had to be a warrior. Most prophets, except martyrdom, he's one of the few that fought back. And so a lot of people think, Muhammad gave prophecy a bad name. And there's a tradition developing now of really attacking Muhammad as a false prophet. And This, for example, this book by Ali Sheena, Understanding Mohammedan Muslims, argues that he was probably epileptic and deluded and had some kind of paranoid schizophrenia. And he presents lots of medical evidence that shows that. I think certainly Muhammad had tremendous difficulties and challenges. But I still maintain in my commentary on the Quran that, you know, there's a line between people that say of Muhammad, you know, that he was a paranoid schizophrenic and totally wrong, and therefore Islam is, you know, just bonkers, to the other end, which is that everything Muhammad did was God-given and transcendentally grounded, and it's the final religion, he's the last and best prophet, and we should all become extreme Muslims immediately and follow the extremist path. On that line, you know, there's a sort of middle ground here, which is where I sit, which is that a lot of what Muhammad said was amazing. A lot of the Quran is incredibly, you know, profound. But there are also problems about his ego, you know, his need for self-esteem. This book shows that because he was an orphan, his mother died, he always needed like 10 times as much love and reassurance as a normal person. This is a psychological fact. If you've been an orphan and abandoned, you feel quite a low self-esteem. So you have to you big yourself up, you know, as a countermeasure. So I think it doesn't harm to do some psychological analysis of Muhammad. And in fact, anyway, what happens is this split between the Sunnis and the Shias. And this is a theme that I'm you know, very mindful of causing a lot of problems in the contemporary Middle East. And in terms of finding a peace policy, we have to crack this one. If you have studied this at all, the Sunni tradition comes from Aisha, who was Muhammad's last wife, who was very young when he married her, and who was the daughter of Abu Bakr, who became the first caliph. He was a powerful Meccan merchant who'd supported Muhammad with money and material and everything. And his daughter was absolutely devoted to Muhammad. She was very young and therefore very impressionable. And she kind of idealized Muhammad, right? And Sunni Islam descends from her. And she had, you know, an interpretation of Muhammad's life and teachings, which grew into what is known as Sunni Islam, which basically said we have to do everything the way Muhammad did it. We have to dress like him, we have to comb our beard like him, we have to pray exactly like he did, we have to do everything like he did. And now that's a young girl's kind of way of thinking, right? It's like, I'm going to model myself on my dream hero, right? But the other kind of Islam, Shiism, which is equally as important and as powerful, comes down from Ali, who was married to Muhammad's daughter, Fatima, and who was actually the cousin of Muhammad. And he was the son of Abu Talib, who'd actually sheltered Muhammad when he was an orphan. And Ali was his best friend, his closest assistant, only a bit younger than him, and also loved Muhammad, and had been with him at every battle, and for most of the first revelations, Ali was the second ever Muslim convert. After Khadija, the wife, Ali became converted to Islam, because he knew Muhammad, he knew he wouldn't be lying. If Muhammad said he received these messages, he had to be telling the truth, because he knew him 100%. He was intelligent, a good man, Ali, and you know, and his understanding of Islam was at a far deeper level, with all due respect, than this young girl, Aisha, who, although lovely and, you know, all the rest of it, just hadn't got a clue what she was talking about in comparison to Ali. So the Shias believe they come down through the lineage of Ali, who passed on certain oral teachings to his own children and to their children and to the first Imams. Now the story, in a nutshell, is very sad, because Ali was eventually killed, martyred, by Sunni followers who basically wanted to silence him and shut him up. Okay? And this goes back to what we were talking about in our little break about the split between esoteric and exoteric knowledge. The Sunnis, by and large, were the big, powerful merchants, bankers, wheeler dealers and money men of Mecca. A lot of them had only converted to Islam at the last minute, when Muhammad came in with an army and you didn't have much choice. They weren't really Muslims at all. They just spotted a really good business opportunity, and they ran Islam Inc., and they spread out in wars of conquest all over the Middle East. They sent armies off to capture Iran, to capture Syria. It was the guy who was sent to capture Syria, called Muawiyah, who then turned on Ali. Now, Ali was a totally different guy. He was a wisdom holder, a true esotericist, who'd known Muhammad deeply, and was like Muhammad in that, because Muhammad was mainly an esotericist who stumbled into having to become a warrior general because of, it was forced upon him. But he had both sides to his nature. Ali represented the Gnostic or esoteric side. But unfortunately, the powers that be, Islam Inc., wanted to silence it. And so they basically killed Ali. They then killed his two sons. And then it had to go underground. So Shiism became a Gnostic underground movement, a bit like witchcraft in the 17th century, and they developed a series of ways of recognizing each other. It was very closely related to Sufism, which was developing at the same time. Here's this wonderful book, A to Z of Sufism. And the Sufis were also having to guard, their wisdom, because when they came out in public, they were often accused of heresy and killed, like happened to Al-Hallaj. So sometimes there was a conflict. Very, very occasionally, you get a good caliph, a good ruler, who realised that he didn't have to have war and wisdom. Actually, it was in his interest to sponsor learning and knowledge at the highest level. So briefly, in Baghdad, under Harun al-Rashid, he founded the House of Wisdom, which invited scholars, philosophers and sages to come and translate books from Sanskrit, from all over India, the Middle East, and Greek texts. So he invited Nestorian Christians and Greek scholars to come and translate them into Arabic and so on. And you got this tremendous encouragement of learning, which to me is essential to Islam. Because Muhammad said, that the ink of the scholar is worth more than the blood of the martyr, which is a very important hadith, right? So scholarship is more important than any battles you can do, any fighting. So all these outer jihads that are going on are actually lesser jihads. The true jihad, which is what they ought to be doing, is the struggle for learning, for wisdom, for consciousness, and for recovering these ancient mysteries. Now in Sufism, which I've met many Sufis over the years, both in the Middle East and elsewhere, they either unconsciously or consciously, but mainly consciously, are understanding that they are in an initiatory lineage of which Muhammad is one very important figure, but that is predating Muhammad. So, for instance, in the Shia tradition, Surawadi, one of their great mystics, Sufis, said that Zoroaster's in the initiatory lineage, Abraham, Christ, Muhammad, and nameless others that we don't know their names, right? So going back to our history of the ancient Middle East, in a sense what the Sufis are saying is we come from them, okay? Years later, if you recall, when Gurdjieff went off looking for the hidden masters of the Middle East, and came across them in obscure romantic places, I mean, that's what he argues, that the Samoan Brotherhood, the brotherhood of symbolised by the bee, which goes to every flower and takes the nectar where it finds it, is going right back to the ancient wisdom of Babylon and before. So, and occasionally it would break out, like in Egypt, in the Fatimid dynasty, you had a Gnostic wisdom dynasty briefly ruling. What did? They founded the Al-Azhar University, which is still the oldest and most important university in the Middle East. And they were universal mystics. So dogmatism, this closure of thinking that happens in Islam, is something that's happened all along, but it's up to the people of wisdom to fight back against it and to insist on their right to teach and research for real truth, because that is actually the true Islamic position, right? Now, I'm saying this because of my experience teaching in the Muslim College in London, where I worked with senior Muslim scholars. And also, there's a wonderful Cambridge Muslim College being set up recently, where they're doing the same thing. But these are British Muslims arguing that, you know, things like academic freedom and rigour of scholarship are not antipathetic to Islam. They're actually the heart of the thing, right? And so the position taken by ISIL and extremists, be they Sunni or Shia, we've got extremist groups on both sides, is actually, you know, not authentic Islam. Okay, so any comments on that? Let's just stop there for a second.